Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here at Qatar Creates and to celebrate the opening of the amazing show at the fire station that we'll be talking about today, Figures of Speech, and also to acknowledge the Qatar Museums, which has been very much a part of this planning. And I'm so fortunate to have two amazing panelists here today. And we're going to try and keep this somewhat informal, so I'm not going to go through a long introduction, but I'll just say briefly that Virgil, who I've known for a number of years, we've been involved in sort of a multi-year conversation, and it's amazing to see what you've accomplished in that time. And Virgil is the Chief Creative Director of Off-White, which he founded, and also the Creative Director of menswear at Louis Vuitton. And our other colleague today, Samir Bantal, who has been a collaborator for a long time with Virgil and is very much at the heart of this show, Figures of Speech, and is also part of a think tank, AMO, within OMA in the Netherlands, which is working the global architectural firm with Rem Koolhaas. And your part of it is really think tank, curator, designer, troublemaker. So it's a great combination to have here today. And, you know, I was thinking about the connection between the two of you. And one of the things that Samir and I talked about is that you have some connections beyond your professional connections. Both of you had parents that were from African countries, your parents from Ghana, who immigrated here to give you the opportunities that I'm sure you've surpassed in their minds. And Samir, also, parents emigrated from Morocco to the Netherlands to start a new life on behalf of their children. And so I think in some level you have this creative connection, but you also have this very personal, visceral connection. And I think that sort of shows in the attitude that you bring to your work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and maybe say, is there anything else that either one of you wants to augment about your biography before we dive into the questions?
Go for it. Well, thanks always for such a lovely sort of setting the tone of the conversation. And I think you're highlighting a lot of important points about what it means to contribute to histories. I think it's safe to say that we're all at a point in our age and practice to understand that there's the recorded history and then there's histories not recorded or not held with regard. Or, lately I've been sort of like a new term that me and my friends and creative community have been masking it as like the formal and then the formal. There's a formalized understanding of art history, design history, but then there's another formal, which I refuse to reduce to a different word. That's simply just not recognized. And that's what's amazing about the youth. We've talked about this at your time with RISD, is engaging the youth and lighting a fire under this other formalized approach. And when I met Samir, we both come from an architecture background. We both know architecture with a capital A. We both know who that's prescribed to be. But we let our own history join the conversation, and the show is very much about that. But Samir can sort of speak to your perspective.
Well, I think the other perspective, and maybe that's going really far back to growing up in a different country, different environment, with also expectations, right? Like if your parents make such a sacrifice of leaving their own country and following their dreams to another country, there's also almost like an expectation of what you then kind of like do with that sacrifice. And of course, like architecture is not the most common kind of, direction then. So it was also finding a way, discovering your own kind of talents, creativity as something that you can explore in many different ways. And therefore, architecture actually did answer many questions. Namely, it was kind of engineering. So you would have the title as an engineer, but still you could use your creativity and other things. So and I think that in a way was a kind of very magical moment. Like, hey, I can still be creative, but the sacrifice would not be for nothing, you know.
Yeah, and I think both of you honored your parents' wishes by starting out as engineers, going into architecture, very respectable professions, and then went beyond that and probably, you know, to places that your parents couldn't have imagined. I think that's a really important message for youth anywhere and for parents anywhere to really trust in the genuine nature of what an individual can bring out into the world with an individual voice, an individual figure of speech. And, you know, if we could take nothing else away from today, I think that's a really important message. But I want to also focus on the fact that, Virgil, I know, and I'm sure Samir too, in your education, you have a really solid foundation of architectural history, art history. You know, you use Caravaggio in the exhibition at the fire station, but you also support artists like Futura, who is an abstract street artist in Brooklyn. And so it's evidence of a way that you think, which is about not falling into the boundaries or the categories, but actually mixing them up in a new way, kind of like your DJ work, and making new disciplines and, you know, boundaryless disciplines in a way, which I think is one of the particulars of this moment in time. And your confidence or your capability to do that has really had an impact beyond the individual work that you've produced personally. You want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's the crux. You know, I think, and like you said, it takes an understanding of art history. You know, one can't simply just like land on Earth and start proclaiming that this is a movement of this type, not knowing actually what preceded each step towards like human enlightenment. You know, and that's why I always like the long perspective. That's why I love history. And I always like looking at it from this sort of, I use the tourist, purist sort of rationale, but if you look at the world from set the purist off to the side, which is like ultra knowledgeable about only the formalized. If you look at it from the tourist perspective, our humankind has been on Earth and just had these epiphanies. You know, you don't need an art history book to say like, oh, us on Earth in this century realized this much. Then all of a sudden, the knowledge base of the whole is at this point, and it keeps evolving. And the work within the exhibition, my work, was all crafted from this understanding of the dissolve between hierarchies, discipline, race, understanding, and who has an effect and what has an effect on our ecosystem, especially when you talk about the hollowed spaces of art, fashion, culture, etc. And so my practice is built on an understanding of this new generation. And if anything, you know, I'm a part of an ecosystem, you know, and that's why the education part, you know, it's taking a formalized education, but then also picking my head up out of textbooks and making some assumptions based on the rationale that I'm seeing in the real world. And I think that's ultimately what took my left turn from a formalized thing like architecture, because it is a study that really prompts you to think. You know, you have no life in architecture if you just repeat what the greats did.
Exactly.
So yeah, like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think architecture as a methodology to almost like approach every you know challenge, I think is a way you get trained to, let's say, dissect and deconstruct the question before you start constructing it, literally. And I think that that's also like very visible in the prototypes that we looked at in the show, like the Nike shoes and the Nike collaboration. Virgil looks at that as an architect, deconstructing it rather than adding things or changing things. He literally completely rips it apart, and then you get foundation, you get facade, you get interior, you get structure, and then you see actually the architectural kind of prototyping that happens on the levels of the shoe, but actually is a kind of methodology that repeats itself in many ways of working. And that I think is at least the way, and maybe also like the reason why I was interested in AMO more than OMA. I mean, still I'm trained as an architect, but to apply architectural thinking to disciplines outside is applying your methodology, and then basically there's no boundary.
Yeah, so I want to get back to that notion of prototype, because you've talked about Virgil as kind of a prototype of a new kind of designer. But I don't want to lose something that Virgil said, which is really about history. And there's a lot on the table right now about who writes the history and how, and whose history is it. And I think one of the things that you've taken on in this exhibition, and also in both of your personal work, is this notion of the fact that objects, design, fashion can either reinforce or destabilize these histories, and in doing so, destabilize prejudices, which is a very important moment in time. So can you talk about how that sits within your curation, within your creation of the work? What do you see as your role and your special, in a way, platform for destabilizing these, long-standing biased traditions?
Well, I think destabilizing is not the ultimate goal, but it definitely.
Dissolving, maybe? Is that the word
no,
you
but
used?
I think destabilizing is definitely an interesting, point of view or approach. But in the end, it's not the ultimate goal. I think, as you rightfully said, and also as Virgil many times said, is that what in our architecture books was obsolete for us was very clear. Like, whether street culture or graffiti was part of an urban culture, but it was not present in urbanistic books, because urbanism was about planning. But urbanism did not talk about the informal use of, let's say, this public space. And so I think that if you learn to look at those things because of a different background, or just because you look at it from a point of view that instability is actually a much more interesting condition than stability, because instability also means a certain dynamic rather than a kind of stable condition. That then becomes almost like your let's say, preferred environment and preferred kind of metric. So
yeah, and what you're describing is really the creative process at its best. And to go back to the prototype point that you made, a prototype is different from a produced object in the sense that it has the ability to change, to deflect, to get better, to get worse, to explore new ideas, and also the ability to embrace critique. And you've talked about that in your discussion of Virgil as a designer, that in a way he's a prototype of a new kind of designer because he employs a lot of those same characteristics in his design approach. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean...
Can you stand being listened to about who you are and described by someone else?
Described as a prototype. Yeah. Well, I mentioned that in a way is that, again, I think that there's not one, let's say, design aesthetics or direction that Virgil brings to the table. I think it's a certain approach, and it's I mean, like, again, like talking about the purist or a tourist, I think that the ability to always put yourself in a position as a tourist is incredibly important and incredibly kind of valuable.
Yeah.
You approach things always as if you're seeing it for the first time, which means that you fundamentally want to understand it and change it without reinventing it. And that, I think, is such a genius move. I must say, it's incredibly effective, and that also enables Virgil then to basically move between disciplines, and which is something that you taught at architecture school or graphic design school, whatever, is not possible.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
how many times did I hear from like teachers like, no, focus on architecture or focus on graphic design.
Yeah. No, it was like complete, this is a mechanism, this is a rationale, this is what the exhibit is. When artist debuts a show or shows work, I like to think of them as sort of like cataloging their epiphany. And for me, as an extension of, say, Duchamp, so radical in order to just survey the whole sort of like purist art community, put a concept on the table that says a urinal is a fountain and drops the mic. To me, that's like a source work, or that's a foundational nudging of our understanding of art or understanding of play. And if you analyze it, it's perfect because it destabilized the sort of like understanding, gave license to a whole new set of work. But it was sort of limited to the purists. It was limited to an archetype. In order for you to follow in that footstep of his logic, there's a high formality that needs to exist. And so obviously I'm years, and that's just citing one example, but that became a way to sort of bridge gaps. So that's the premise, is like if you even look at the audience amongst us today, I can just feel the energy of diversity, different backgrounds, different histories that may or may not be recorded within the same history books that we're. So what you hear in Samir and I, or if you look at a fashion show, if you look at a painting, there's this tremendous amount of dancing between the canon and this new sort of like free space, free thinking, new generation. Like it feels like the Renaissance, like when I first studied art history, learned about the Renaissance, it's interesting when you're young, almost the very first thing you read becomes your starting point. And for me, I picked up the book. It was, it was the Dome, like Bernini or something. It was the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. So it's like in my mind, that's when art started. As you get older, you start understanding what came before. And then I think as creators today, what this show is validating a different starting point. And then it's also, not to be overlooked, it's liberating. The idea is that the show sort of unlocks this epiphany within oneself. And that to me is what the reason for existing. Like that's what it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is really changing perceptions and your preconceptions. So if you're thinking within the confines of the traditional boundaries, you can't cross easily. But if you think about raising the perch to a higher level where you're seeing across the boundaries, then you're starting from a different working place. And that's very much what you've done in this show. You're known for your creative multiplicity, which is a really wonderful aspect of the show, and also for defining new kind of crossovers and parameters for each area of interest. And I've heard you really talking to young people, a new generation, about really trusting their curiosity, that it's not necessarily something that is taught all the time, and the importance of individual curiosity and the trust that you have to build. It's almost like a relationship you build with your curious mind. And I'm wondering, you also talk about giving space, for your mind to wander, that's really a creative way of working for you. How do you refuel your own curiosity?
For one, it's everything's linked to conversation. To me, travel / because there's an ecosystem, there's like a heartbeat to the world. And what I only get frightened when like things become stable, like if you look for comfort, if you read the news cycle and sort of gather only what you want, if you are only friends with people with a particular point of view, as a fashion designer, something that's like a high rate of production, to me it's constantly, I just posed this the other day, it's about is clothing important? Constantly, like why? Being able to have a new answer that owns up to the responsibility is my duty as a designer to exist. I need to be able to constantly question and think. So I think a good word is instability is actually natural. Somebody earlier asked me about perfectionism, and I'm like very aggressively against this idea of perfectionism because I think it's a tool for our heart when it feels uncomfortable to have like a different excuse to not release. And obviously I love the education and license part about this type of work because it's important to understand the domino effect of design culture. Like when we talk about, is this a renaissance? It obviously is. If the cultural ecosystem allows for new voices to tell new stories, new buildings to be built, new forms of fashion design, new forms of runway shows, new forms of exhibitions, then I feel like we're in sync with the contemporary society. We should be having flying cars and very diverse exhibits of all types.
Yeah, so a version of this exhibit started in Chicago at the Museum of Contemporary Art and broke attendance records. It was one of the highest attended shows in the history of the museum. And then it's traveled through several venues and now ending up here in Doha. Do you want to talk about how you approach the body of work differently in coming to Doha and what your thinking was in the installation at the fire station?
I think, indeed, like Chicago at the MSA was at some moment also very, known territory for us because we've been there many times. We looked at the space. We had a model in Paris where we would work on together, sometimes remotely, sometimes live together at Virgil's atelier. But for the, we did one in Atlanta, then Boston, and for Doha. When the fire station came up as a location, I thought it was really interesting because the building itself is, of course, like built around a courtyard, and therefore it's a no-brainer almost to kind of use the public space and use the part outside of it, because of course a lot of the artworks and the messages in the show come directly or are referencing directly kind of an urban condition. So rather than keeping one gallery as the main one, we quite quickly decided to have, let's use the full ground floor of the whole fire station as the gallery space, even though it's not gallery space, which is of course easier said than done, but in the end, we ended up with a number of gallery spaces that work really well with the idea of the, let's say, the themes and the disciplines, or the, almost like the chapters that are in the show. So we have one show that really deals with the kind of introduction, the early works, the fashion, and Virgil's role in the music industry. And then we go outside, another gallery space dedicated purely to one chapter, which is Black Gaze, and deals with ethnicity and race as the main topic. And then the final gallery, Double Height, we have art and design. So I think that enables us to kind of play with going inside the gallery space, going outside again, spending some time outside, going inside, and so it's a completely different trajectory, basically. And it also enables us to put things that were inspired by the urban condition, like the billboard, for example, to really place it also in a public space.
Yeah, and it's almost like there's a micro and then the macro. For Samir and I, it was extremely important to pull the specific type of work that I do out of the Western hemisphere of the world. And that kind of goes to your original point of, like, our point of view and background is from a completely different place than the core of my work, which is in the United States or in Paris. These sort of like certified epicenters of pop culture. And there's something, in my mind, damaging if you keep reinforcing that. Or, at least we need to think, Samir was like, for sure the show needs to be in Doha. And I think that's what inspires me even more than the show itself, is that the reason why there's cultural institutions is so that there's a sharing that happens. My work can live on Instagram. It can live in Paris. It can live in Tokyo. It has a meaning, but to remove the sort of commerce part, because obviously in my work, I play with brands like Duchamp can play with a ready-made object, start questioning what's the value in this object, or what's the cultural significance of editing something that has inherent value. If you leave all that to the side, like the proof already reinforced itself the 30 seconds after I got out of the car. We had breakfast this morning, we talked about this sort of like the importance of Doha and it as a cultural hub. Getting out of the car, a young Qatari woman handed me a shoe and said, "Could you sign it?" and told me what to write on it. Virgil was here. All of a sudden, it's like if you have the right viewing angle, then you can understand the true intention of my work. It's almost like the premise had been set 20 years ago to give license to myself. Just this woman coming up to me, handing an object that I went to Nike, made as an art object, not a sneaker, give me one shoe, to it be signed in Doha. Like, that's the lexicon.
Yeah.
There's so many layers of contemporary value and logic, and that's the sort of rigor. Yeah. But then it can all dissolve, as a tourist and purist. It's just a sneaker, it's just an exhibit. But that we drew a line between what happens in Paris, New York, what have you, so that there's a courtyard in Doha where kids of this new generation that might have this hey, we're in a community, we like sneakers, we love this sort of new vein that's happening in fashion, people call it streetwear. I see it in the fancy stores on the fancy street, but there's a community underlying, and so that's what gets me sort of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of figures of speech going through the exhibit, which everyone has to go see, it's really remarkable. I think the way that it's curated is not so much about the objects, and you've talked so much about how important context is for objects, but the objects are kind of the words maybe, or I don't want to be corny about it, but they are the figures of speech. But really what I felt walking through in the way the spaces are set up inside and outside, it's really like a walk through your mind, which is really fascinating. And the impact is far more than, it's that, I think the interaction that you described is far more important than the sneaker itself. It's the notion of what you represent to someone who wants you to sign that shoe and say that you were here in Doha.
Yeah.
And so that part of your mind is on display in a really, I think, lovely and a way that has a huge impact on how people think about the future.
Yeah, and it's worthy to know. Like, meeting number one with Samir, let's pretend to be purists, only painting, only sculpture. It's almost too obvious, and I would hope that anyone with a sort of like ounce of I'm a purist too. I love things that are super rational. I studied architecture at Bauhaus style, so that's what makes me most comfortable. I think what made this destabilization uncomfortable was like, let's not do the obvious and edit this work to try to position it as highbrow. You have to get into the weeds. You can probably speak more to it.
Yeah, what I think is also, like a message inside the exhibition as well is like, there's a way to demand your position at the table, and which is another, I think, very fundamental, red thread in Virgil's work and his professional work as an artist, as a DJ. But it basically says like you can talk about us, but you have to talk with us.
Yeah.
And you can fill in who us is, and whether it's young people or whether it's artists or whether it's creative people or whether it's people from a different background. I think it basically shows, there's a way to work your way and demand that you become part of a conversation, part of a dialogue, rather than just a subject of it.
Yeah, it's so important, and I think it's even more than a seat at the table. I think it's who gets to make the table, and who gets to set the table.
That's the the irony is like tenfold.
Yeah.
A large part of my design career was birthed the moment that I didn't get into RISD.
Yeah, but we did give him an honorary degree last year, so he got a degree anyway.
But just the irony is that it all is like, how do you, in your time on Earth, create a seat at a table? Because when I studied art, even when I pick up monographs today, there's like this, it only works if you believe that they're special and you're not. You have to look at it at a certain angle to sort of, and that comes in fashion, insert famous designer here, art, architecture, music. And I really feel like this Enlightenment period that applies to our generation is just shifting the angle and understanding. All of a sudden, culture's a lot more participatory. It's less weighted on a skewed angle of who gets to participate. And so, there's work in the show that relates to my trip to RISD. I broke into a furniture design studio and asked them, hey, what do you think I should do with IKEA? And that work is in Doha, just like a quick round table with students. The indecision, the critique of my work, me questioning their ideas. And I feel like you know, the exhibit captures that because it's just a pile of ideas rather than saying, hey, here's the Virgil monograph of what a chair should be.
Yeah.
And to stand on it as if I'm, you know, a designer from 20 years ago would. Bending that is the practice.
Yeah, it's much more interesting for sure. And one of the things that's thrown up in the air right now is about how truth is represented, and also credibility. What I think for young artists starting out, and I also want to just point to the fact that you mentioned about rejection, and I've talked to so many young designers here who are part of the FTA event that talked about how many times they had to try to get something to succeed. And so it's really that sense of believing in yourself and not giving up for anything. It's like you don't have a choice. It's you know, it's your fuel is to just keep going. And it's so important because success can look easy and it never is. But I also think that there is a real need for young creatives to understand how to see their truth as valid credibility, you know, to really give credibility, valid credibility to their own truth. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about who decides, you know, what is credible. How is that happening now?
It's a good question for Samir, because like if I wasn't, legitimately, if I didn't have my 17 day jobs, I would probably be like, I'd want to be like Samir's intern, not even like, you know, making models. And I do wonder, like in your studio, like how do you, piggybacking, like what validates, or how do you, being open-minded, like how do you validate good ideas, bad ideas?
Yeah, that's
a whole long conversation.
Maybe that's the most difficult question ever. Like,
let me, for the listeners at home too, like, I'm talking a lot and I'll stop, but as a student, like, a large part of the hidden part of my work is that I went to architecture school and there's this place called OMA, AMO. You know, it was almost like the only safe haven for real radical thinking, and might say real by like things get made. They're not just theoretical.
Yeah.
And so you being of that tribe, how do you validate?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, like if I look back at my, you know, when I started architecture school, I think like second year, people were talking about Rem Koolhaas, and I mispronounced the name also. But they were like, yeah, that's the firm, that's the architect to work for. And I was like, okay, well then that's what I want to do. Then that's where I want to work. But we're like, yeah, but impossible, you know, for many reasons, etc. So, but you set yourself a kind of goal to do that, and I think there's it's a mentality maybe, or it's a kind of approach. I think it was not. I never sent a resume to OMA. Never. I never officially applied for a job. It was basically, you know, how do I? And it reminds me a bit of like what you did with the Kanye T-shirts at the store, like the print store. You make them, you leave them, someone will pick it up, and get it. And I mean that's a different approach. It's a kind of like a hustle approach maybe, but that's, you know, the way that I also got do my first job at OMA. And I was like, well, you know, if I meet this guy, I'm sure I can convince him to hire me. But if I send him my portfolio,
you're in a stack.
I'm going to be like one of those, like, you know, one of the stack. And then and that was basically, it wasn't really a kind of strategy. It was like, I'm not going to send a portfolio. I know that will not make me stand out. And so, and I think maybe that's also like what you look for when you're working with your team is, you know, not to specifically go with this kind of traditional route or expected way of working or expected outcome of a question. And so that attitude is, I think, something extremely important.
Yeah, and
to validate.
I would add, super pivotal, underline this point. What Samir just described is like, the world works inherently under a politic. That's like a big, there's politics floating in the air right in front of us right now. Because, like we said before, who gets to write history?
Yeah.
I spent a large part of my life being naive. You can kind of feel the naivete. It's like, wait, politics, that's on the news. That doesn't apply to art. It doesn't apply to, I want to make this. How come I can't make that? Well, because I don't look like the archetype that has, and same here. It's like, if I'm going to spend 10 years of my life trying to work in one specific office to sort of get this license to create, realizing that you don't need that to create. And so that, and I think to your question, how do you validate, sort of what I look for is a politic. It's when you look through the show, you can almost, if you look through with just like a pair of glasses to see, imagine the politics that I had to navigate to create some of these things that exist with brand.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't own the brand. The things that I'm putting through are highly advanced. And in order for that to exist, I have to come with a rationale. I have to craft invisible things for them to exist and hopefully connect to the outside world.
Yeah. And you
Another metaphor that I often used, and actually I used in my thesis, which was about AMO, because I was like, that's where I want to work. But one of the metaphors I used was a Trojan horse to describe AMO, because it was actually, speaking an architectural language, but in the meantime, not doing architecture. Because you feel that there's a kind of value in a sort of, thinking or that actually enables you to think outside of the end product being architecture. So that could be a kind of, a new flag for Europe. It could be, like how do you deal with this brand A, B, or C? And it was a kind of direct response to a changing environment for architects, because it was, it went from, public to private much more. And so I found myself also using that kind of approach in even entering the office, like, as a Trojan horse almost. Like you think I'm here to work on a project, but actually I'm here to get a job. And it was just a different way.
Yeah, but it's that sort of bravery of approach, because you've said too that you don't like to be dictated to. No one does, and you don't like to dictate to others. And sometimes the way you like to change someone's mind is what you call rearranging the furniture, just showing them a different experience. And I think that works. That's really evident in the show. But it's a different, more generous and more community-based way, I think, of moving a culture forward. It's like you have something to say, and you're just going to show it by showing an alternative rather than explaining to someone, this is what you have to do, this is how you have to be a designer.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's, as we sort of like think about the opening and, the ultimate success is that doors are opened. Like, we can come up with fancy rationales that check our box about this, that, et cetera, et cetera. If the summation, if the end equation isn't license for more people to create in any sphere, to me, that's the ultimate benchmark.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a good place to end, except that I think I'd like to just see if we can have time for maybe one question. And I'm going to ask Virgil to pick the lucky person who gets to ask the question, because it would be nice to end with someone from the audience having a direct part of the dialogue. Does someone have a question that's It's always hard to be the first, and this time the only, but is there a question? There we go. Virgil, you want to take this?
Hi, thank you very much. Virgil, I wondered whether you could just explain a little bit more about what you meant at the beginning of your talk about the formal and the formal. I'm not an architectural expert, so I just need a little bit of baseline help in understanding that concept. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the formal and the formal. So, you know, like, architecture works if a set of people sort of agree on certain milestones and things, moments. Almost in your mind, like, the first thing you think of when you think of an architect might be like Corbusier, like a guy with circle glasses sitting in his office smoking a cigar. You know, that archetype is architecture, as you pick up an encyclopedia. If you pick up, and we who practice architecture know these moments of Villa Savoye, or like falling Frank Lloyd Wright, or these like just basic understood principles. So categorize that as formal. Then, you know, where I'm from, which is Ghana in West Africa, that's why I love traveling, even to Doha. Take the natural architectural language, which is everything you see when you look out the window. You know, there's a history, there's a rationale to buildings, there's a style. You'd be hard-pressed to find a textbook that is well documented as these architects smoking a cigar that fit the image, to find that history. And obviously, it even dates back further, especially like the typology within Africa. There's a way, just because the doors don't shut completely doesn't mean that it's not architecture. Just the way that cities organically grow are linked to our human innate nature. They're not linked to the printed page. So just to subdivide, it's like there's the formal that is agreed upon. Then there's the formal that's naturally occurring, which once your mind is tuned right, you can start seeing the natural beauty. Like Samir can speak, like a lot of what you guys focus on has been challenging architecture with exactly the non-obvious.
Yeah, and I think that the mistake is then to call the second the informal.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is why I've been like, you know, vehemently against, because the mind naturally wants to put things in boxes and rank them.
Right.
So for me, instead of denouncing one, because that's a completely different political conversation, to say what you've learned in your textbooks, like let's save that for a different Sunday. Let's start thinking about different societies, not ranking them lower, but actually, if you understand them correctly, can inform what we thought was the benchmark. And so,
Yeah, because what you're describing is it's not just the multiplicity of practice, but the multiplicity of hierarchies. And you know, that's what this time is about, is really exploring how to think more carefully and from a more humanitarian perspective, moving those hierarchies forward, or maybe disassembling many of those hierarchies. So it's a really important discussion. I think we could continue it, but I think it's clearly there in your show. I think this conversation lives in your show. And so I urge everyone to see it. And thank you both for being here, and wish you great success with an extraordinary exhibition.
let's do one more question.
Okay, good.
Hello, this is awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Amani. I'm a jewelry designer from Egypt. and I was a finalist, the winner last year, the FTA. I mean, I love that conversation and how it goes beyond the expected and the boundaries and who writes history. And your work is more, it's not just a brand, but it's a statement to think outside of the box. And appreciate a different perspective. Like you talk about a streetwear, one community will look at it and relate to it one way, and another community who's almost the other extreme have the same, a similar connection, yet very different because of coming from different worlds. And I think this is the amazing thing about being able to create. So as a designer from Egypt, I'm trying to keep my DNA and tell a story of where I come from. Yeah, sometimes it's really hard to connect that with a different audience because they might call it exotic, but not take it in as part of their world. So how can I do that? Be able to tell the story, connect, and almost educate through my work.
Mm-hmm. I think the key word that Rosanne came, like this idea of instability. It was in Samir's answer too. It's like, hey, I want to work at, it was almost like, doesn't make sense. I want to work at OMA, but I refuse to make a resume. You know, to me, it's such a contemporary notion. We're a part of the anti-generation. You know, it's not even us. It's in our, like, if you ask me to design a glass, 9 times out of 10, a drinking glass, I'll design it so it sits upside down and doesn't have a function. Why did I do that? It's my generation. A drinking glass with a hole in it. That's totally something I would do. You know, I should do that actually. But I'm trying to be facetious but answer your question. A lot of people ask, when I sit with young designers who are looking to express themselves, inherently, the reason why the traction isn't coming is because it's actually, there's no tension in the idea. And that's not to say, notice I'm not saying if it's good or bad. There's nothing that doesn't make sense. And so and when we do that, like we do it with conviction, you know, I can imagine Samir challenging a client saying, you asked for this. He said it in his answer, like, it's an architectural approach. When someone asks you for a jewelry design, the first opportunity missed is to design jewelry. The right contemporary sense is to question what jewelry is and then propose that as an answer, and immediately there's attention.
Yeah, and I think it's important for non-designers to understand that you're not talking about creating experiences of futility. You're talking about turning people's perceptions and preconceptions upside down so that they can look at something and look at any circumstance differently and think, why does it have to be this way? What are all the possibilities that aren't considered if you just assume it's this way?
Then immediately you're not in the soup of a million jewelry designers from your point of view. You know, and this is my perspective on, you know, life is short and you're always trying to like get ideas out and have people feed back so you can do more. One more.
So I just had a very short, quick question. So we're VCU students, fashion design students from VCU. I just wanted to ask if you had any advice as we enter the work field in Doha and after, like internationally.
Same advice as the last. It's like, you know, I just hope that fear, well, it's like a discerning look at the industry. You know, I spend a tremendous amount of time educating and absorbing and traveling and being a part of contemporary culture. Like this work that we can't do from afar. It takes strong opinions You know, it takes a discerning eye. And so as a student, read the room. You know, look at your work and then look at your contemporaries, your people in your classroom, look at people in professional practice, and challenge yourself to ask the hard questions like, what makes it different? And first rate is just the work itself, like a shoe, a sneaker, a painting. The level that I encourage young students to operate is to crumple up all the work and throw it in the trash. Like, what's the actual idea? Why does it have to exist? And if you can answer, you know, those sorts of like tier up questions, all of a sudden, anything you think of falls into this relevant bucket, and things start to synergize in a different way. And I think that's the one thing I encourage most with like young thinking is like these industries we're in, they're kind of glamorous, they're fun. You could just look at the end result, be inspired, and make a version of it. And what this show is about is trying to sort of, within the chaos, is present the rationale alongside the different artifacts.
Thank you.
Our last question.
One last one we could do in the very back.
Hello, so I'm Jenna, I'm Egyptian. I'm a first-year architecture student in Montreal. And I was just wondering that, do you think you've always had your creativity naturally, or do you think that architecture has enhanced your creativity and made you who you are today?
I'll answer then, Samir. Yeah, architecture is my secret weapon. You know, I think there was no better design practice. You know, I'm so happy that I didn't like study anything else, because it's so universal. You know, it's a methodology. You know, it's one of these, like, it's about practice and thinking and history. It merges all those things. What would you say?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a method. Well, I mean, question everything, right? I mean, it's a flag in the show. It is questioning everything, and even if, you know, it's design a library, what is a library? Instead of starting to design a library, I think that that is such a valuable, I think, lesson that I got from architecture, but also can apply to anything else.
Yeah, you know, we're having this conversation in one of the most progressive buildings. You know, the buildings inspire this type of conversation. So yeah, architecture. Thanks.
Terrific. Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't get to that you wanted to say today?
It's a well-rounded talk.
Should do this more often.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.